everybody, it's Eric Paffenfoos, and welcome to 2023, our first buy day of the new year. It's Friday, so it must be time for a new buy day. But before we say goodbye to 2022, I thought it might be interesting just to talk about some of the books that we profiled right here on the show that actually sold over the past year. A couple of my favorites were, Amanda, do you remember when we went to the barn in Connecticut and we pulled out that old 18th century copy of Milton's Paradise Lost?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, that sold to a Milton collector who was actually really interested in the manuscript biography that was at the end of that book, which was really interesting. That was in season one. Also in season one, we profiled a big, huge art book. It was one of the first books we did by McKim, Mead, and White, the famous architects. And that sold to an architect that was actually restoring one of the McKim, Mead, and White properties. So another really cool thing.
Nice.
And just this past holiday season, for Christmas, we sold two items that we just recently profiled on the show. One was the Harvard Classics that we got in Lewisburg, that nice set of the 50 volumes. Well, that just sold. It's a great holiday gift. And the other was the poem, the Visit from St. Nicholas. Now, we weren't sure what to price that because newspapers generally are not that valuable, but it had good content. So we put it on eBay with a starting bid of $1. And would you like to guess what that newspaper actually ended up selling for? It sold just after Christmas. So we had it on right through New Year's Eve, Christmas Day, and then it sold.
I'm going to guess $15.
Okay, well, that's a good guess. And that's what these newspapers that we sell in the shop often go for. But it actually sold for $164.50.
Whoa.
And there was a massive bidding frenzy. And I don't know if it was between the Livingstonites and the Moorites. And I don't know who won in the end. But we mailed it out and made somebody very happy.
That's great.
But we're going to talk today about two books that we recently found, one of which has also sold, and I have to get wrapped today. So we're profiling it right before it goes out the door. Normally, we don't do that. We list the books after buy day, but this is one that we listed, and then it sold again for the holiday season. This is a really interesting book, Amanda, because if you look at it, it was published in London in 1809, and it's a book about establishing an institution for the education of women. It was published in London, but it was written by an American author. Her name was Helena Wells, and she was from South Carolina. And her father was the printer down there of the Gazette in South Carolina during the American Revolution, leading right up to the American Revolution. He was a loyalist, however, and he fled, and he took her to England, where she grew up. And she believed, and it is outlined in this book, and what a beautiful book it is. It has this just beautiful, beautiful leather binding, a lovely spine, and it talks about how important it is for women to be educated so that they can become active members of the workplace. And it's fairly radical in that sense because it was encouraging women not to stay in the home and the spheres of domesticity, but instead to go out and work in the workplace. Well, there was a young man who was on his World Travelers who picked up a copy of this book, and he was thinking about how to invent a revolver. And that man's name was Samuel Colt. And believe it or not, Samuel Colt of revolver fame bought this book. And if you look in the front of the book, that is his signature, Samuel Colt. It's rather remarkable because Colt goes on to found a major factory, and he establishes in that factory a series of interesting reforms specifically geared towards workers. He's the first person to have an assembly line, and he has interchangeable parts, but he also implements a 10-hour workday, an hour lunch period, mandatory, and education for his employees, which include women. So you begin to think, well, maybe Samuel Colt was influenced by reading Helena Wells' book from 1809. I will say, however, Samuel Colt is not a figure necessarily to be admired. Not only was he involved in selling guns to anybody who wanted them, but he also employed women, unfortunately, at less than half the rate he employed men. And he had them do something that was particularly dangerous. Do you know what the women did for Samuel Colt in his factory world? Well, they handled the ammunition, and they worked just a little bit away from the rest of the factory in case anything went wrong. So Samuel Colt, the great gunmaker, and Thoughts on Female Education. A fascinating book, already sold and on its way out the door. But the second book we're going to profile today is really remarkable and just was discovered yesterday by one of our listeners, Toby, who was flipping through and discovered this book, Marjorie by J. Malcolm Bird. Now, at first glance, there may not be much to this book, but when you open it up and you learn more about its contents, you realize this was a book about a medium named Marjorie who was in Boston in the 1920s. This book was published in 1925. Now, Marjorie, we've talked a little bit about mediums and spiritualism and why in the aftermath of World War I, when so many people were killed, it became a real fad to want to connect with one's loved ones that were lost and also to sort of question why. Well, Marjorie was a part of that culture, and she really transformed Boston culture at the time, so much so that she got the notice of the leading scientists of the day. And Scientific American, the journal, offered a reward in Boston in 1924 for anyone who could prove to be an actual true medium. And they assembled a series of scientists and mathematicians, psychologists, who would all go judge the medium. And Marjorie applied for this award. And J. Malcolm Bird, who was a mathematician, was one of the judges. He went to go to a seance with Marjorie, and Bird was convinced that Marjorie was the real thing. So convinced that he wrote this entire book. But one person who was not convinced, Amanda, was Harry Houdini, the great musician. And he developed, strangely enough, a box which he then placed the medium inside so that she would be unable to use her feet or any other part of her body to manipulate things like ringing a bell or doing other things. Isn't that amazing? So here's a picture of before the seance where they're actually holding hands with Houdini. And then here's some other pictures of Marjorie, not in a box, but doing the seance. Now, Houdini claims it's all a fraud and gets the committee members not to award the Scientific American prize to Marjorie. But Marjorie has the last laugh because Marjorie brings back her brother Walter during one of the seances, and Walter says, "Houdini, you're not going to last till Halloween." And Houdini goes off, and actually the following year, in 1826, he is punched by a fan in the stomach, his appendix bursts, and by golly, he dies on Halloween, October 31st, 1926, predicted by Walter. Now, this book is fascinating enough in itself, but imagine what we found in the book. Come look at this. This is incredible. This book was owned by a gentleman by the name of Philip Hale. Philip Hale was a writer for the Boston Herald. And he and his wife attended several of the seances with Marjorie, and inside the book are the transcript notes of the seances that Philip Hale actually attended. And it talks about things that Walter was saying. It talks about him explaining to them that after death, there's nothing to be feared. Also, it says, don't ever get buried with your jewelry on, because ghosts like Walter will take it and bring it back and give it to people. It's a really remarkable thing. Also in the book are a series of letters from Marjorie's husband, who was a doctor, Dr. Cranon. He was part of the whole seances with him, to Mr. Hale, thanking him for the nice review that he wrote of the book, but also telling him that Walter was composing a poem. And even apparently Walter the ghost was very concerned about how spelling would work in the poem. This is all fascinating stuff. There's even talk in the notes of the seances that the Hales ask, when will they get to see teleplasm or ectoplasm? And this was something made famous by Ghostbusters later on. So an amazing book on spiritualism from the 1920s. We're going to end today with a really funny book, Amanda. I was reminded at the holidays, because we were cooking a lot of food, that, well, let's just let this book speak for itself. The World of Warcraft official cookbook, an amazing cookbook because it gives you skill level and rewards each time you cook something. So just like the game, you gain in strength, but it also takes a fictional world and it uses real ingredients to create fictional things. So for instance, you can have honey spiced lichen, but instead of lichen, you use kale. You could have yak broth, but of course you could use tofu, and there's even Crunchy Spider Surprise, which sounds a bit like Monty Python's Crunchy Frog. Our funny book of the week. Well, thanks for watching. Looking forward to a brand new year of Buy Day Fridays.